Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
A very good evening to you. We're at Buckingham Palace on the second day of Donald Trump's state visit, with the US president praising the relationship between America and the UK, saying it was the greatest alliance the world has ever known. Well, he was speaking at a news conference side by side with Theresa May, and he said Washington was committed to what he called a phenomenal post-Brexit trade deal, insisting everything, including the NHS, would be on the table. Mrs May, who stands down as Conservative Party leader on Friday, spoke of the precious and profound alliance between the two countries, but said friends could also be open and disagree. And Mr Trump revealed he turned down a request from Jeremy Corbyn for a meeting while he was here in the UK. Today, the Labour leader addressed thousands of people protesting against Mr Trump's state visit. Let's get more now from our political editor, Laura Koonsberg.
He always draws a crowd, but doesn't always please them. When the president comes to town, controversy is never far. The Prime Minister was his first international guest at the White House. This Kodak moment for the Mays and the Trumps will be one of her last. A press conference with Donald Trump on a momentous occasion, a grand leaving do for Theresa May. Clear even from the niceties, the two have sometimes clashed.
I've always talked openly with you, Donald, when we have taken a different approach, and you've done the same with me. I've always believed that cooperation and compromise are the basis of strong alliances, and nowhere is this more true than in the special relationship.
For any British and American pair, this relationship matters, but nothing ever knowingly undersold by Donald Trump.
Prime Minister May, it's been a true honor. I have greatly enjoyed working with you. You are a tremendous professional and a person that loves your country dearly. Thank you very much. Really an honor. The American and the British people, it's the greatest alliance the world has ever known. Thank you, Prime Minister. Thank you. Thank you.
As the UK stumbles towards leaving the EU, the President has questioned the Prime Minister's approach.
I seem to remember the President suggested that I sued the European Union, which we didn't do. We went into negotiations and we came out with a good deal.
Yeah, that's not such a... I would have sued, but that's okay. I would have sued and settled, maybe, but you never know. She's probably a better negotiator than I am. I think we're going to have a great trade deal, yes. I think we're going to have a great and very comprehensive trade deal. When you're dealing in trade, everything's on the table. So NHS or anything else, or a lot more than that.
That's one of the things thousands in Westminster would rail against, though. These protests weren't fake news, as the President claimed, although there were pockets of support for him, and the crowd's much smaller than last time. Leading the charge, though, the Labour leader, who refused last night to go to the Queen's dinner in honour of Donald Trump.
Together we can make a big difference. Together we can change this world. Together we can bring about that peace and justice. And by our demonstration here today, we've shown just how determined we, all of us, are to achieve that better place and that better world.
But then it emerged from the President's lips. Mr Corbyn had asked to see him after all.
I don't know Jeremy Corbyn. Never met him, never spoke to him. He wanted to meet today or tomorrow, and I decided that I would not do that. I think that he is, from where I come from, somewhat of a negative force. I think that people should look to do things correctly as opposed to criticize. I really don't like critics as much as I like and respect people that get things done.
It's not all straightforward between the Tories and Mr Trump, though. Tensions over Iran, climate change, fractures his next opposite number will have to confront. But who?
So I know Boris. I like him. I've liked him for a long time. I think he'd do a very good job. I know Jeremy. I think he'd do a very good job. I don't know Michael. But would he do a good job, Jeremy? Tell me.
All too much, finally, perhaps, for Mr May. Always an unlikely pair, perhaps. One shameless, one shy. Time is nearly up on this particular duo. The motorcade, of course, as always, will roll on.
Theresa May and Donald Trump are very different characters, very different leaders. And even the careful choreography of a state visit like this can't mask the fractures and the difficulties between the United States and the United Kingdom. But this, of course, is a relationship that will matter for longer and will last longer than two occupants will stay in office.
Some of the contenders for number 10 might meet Donald Trump while he's here. But who was snapped on the way to see him first tonight? An old friend, Nigel Farage, who, just like this president, glories in going against the grain. Laura Kunzberg, BBC News, Westminster.
Well, as we've been hearing just there, demonstrations have been taking place against President Trump's visit. Thousands of people gathered in Westminster, as our special correspondent Lucy Manning explains.
As President Trump drove by, if he was looking out of his car window, he will have spotted something that looked a little familiar. He admitted he'd seen a small protest, undoubtedly this one, but dismissed others as fake news.
It definitely got inside his head. You know, he was reported after last year saying, I used to love coming to London, but when they put out blimps to make me feel unwelcome, I guess no reason to come to London.
Yeah, but he's come back again and he's got a state visit, so it hasn't worked, has it?
He's been invited by Theresa May in her infinite wisdom.
You are fake news.
Protesters came armed with humour, mocking rather than welcoming the president.
I'm a very stable genius.
It was thousands rather than hundreds of thousands who filled Trafalgar Square and marched down Whitehall, the sounds of protest drifting into Downing Street as he met the Prime Minister. Why are you marching today?
I'm just sickened that Donald Trump's been invited here, that he's getting special treatment.
My biggest problem with him is the fact that he is racist, and the fact that the Queen of England stood next to an open racist gesture. It was absolutely and utterly disgusting.
And what about other leaders, though, that have come to this country?
I have the same stance with regards to someone like China and Saudi Arabia as well.
I understand he's the president of the USA and we have to interact with him and perhaps have him here, but I really don't think it warranted the full state visit.
The crowds are substantial and they're noisy, but what they haven't done is stop Donald Trump coming to the UK, coming to central London and having his state visit and meeting with the Queen. The Labour leader had boycotted the chance to dine with the president, but not the opportunity to protest against him. Why did you decide to boycott the state dinner last night? You went to other state dinners with the Chinese leader. Why did you boycott this one?
Sorry, can I just...
Mr. Corbyn, you met with Hamas. Why wouldn't you meet with the American president? Later, President Trump revealed Mr. Corbyn had asked for a meeting, which the president turned down. There were pockets of tension between the few pro-Trump supporters among the thousands of other demonstrators.
So there's been state visits where, controversial political figures have come before and hundreds of thousands of people haven't protested, so there's a little bit of hypocrisy and double standards in that. I think Trump does deserve a state visit.
The president claimed there were thousands on the streets cheering him. He got the numbers right, but their message wrong. Lucy Manning, BBC News.
Well, in a moment, we'll hear from our political editor, Laura Kunzberg, but first, our North America editor, John Sopel, is here. Mr. Trump, John, effusive today about the special relationship and talking about how important it is and all that. Some might wonder how much he means that.
Well, I think he was in a very good mood. I thought he was playful. I thought he was very generous towards Theresa May. I thought there was a twinkle in his eye and kind of some of the way he was answering questions as well. And I thought, he was very upbeat in the language about this phenomenal trade deal that could be struck. And I think that will simultaneously really please British ministers and terrify them. The idea that everything is on the table, the idea that the Americans will be saying, well, we'll have a bit of that NHS market, the National Health Service, we'll do some deals there, and then, you know, whether it be agricultural products or anything else, I think those are the sort of things that might just be a little bit worrying. I also thought the other thing that was interesting that he talked about was this Huawei deal, about whether Britain should allow them to build any of the 5G network. There'd been talk about this could limit security and intelligence cooperation. He played that right down, and again, I think that will be welcomed by British ministers. And of course, being generous to Theresa May, he's not going to be dealing with her over this phenomenal trade deal in the future. And so he was looking at Jeremy Hunt and Boris Johnson and Michael Gove and being very playful about that. They're the ones that are going to have to land this trade deal in the future, and they're going to have their wits about them, because he's a tough negotiator, and for all the generous talk, America is not going to give anything away. The slogan is "Make America Great Again," not "Make Britain Great Again."
OK, John, thank you for that. Let's turn to Laura. Laura, I mean, as we were discussing, they're kind, generous words from the President for Theresa May, but the fact is she's leaving as Conservative Party leader on Friday, and soon she won't be Prime Minister.
That's absolutely right, and I think the government and Number 10 will be relieved that the big press conference, those big moments today, went off without a hitch. I think for this government, as probably for any foreign government, trying to handle Donald Trump is a bit like trying to carry a grenade with the pin already pulled out. So they'll be pleased that the body language was warm. But as you suggest, we are on the verge of a much bigger change in our politics, and therefore a new relationship, a new partnership between the existing American president and the next British Prime Minister. There's also a bit of an awkwardness for Jeremy Corbyn tonight, having refused that invitation to see Mr. Trump at the Queen's invitation at Buckingham Palace in the state dinner last night. It was then revealed today he'd asked for a meeting after all. So I think that's slightly embarrassing for Mr. Corbyn, a slightly confusing message coming from him. Does he really want to have contact with Donald Trump or not? Although he did say today he's always interested in trying to have dialogue. But the sense really tonight is that, for better or worse, the page is about to be turned. People are now focusing and concentrating in Westminster on which one of the leadership contenders is going to see Donald Trump in the next 24 hours. We expect Jeremy Hunt to have a meeting with him, of course, one of the contenders to be the next Prime Minister, possibly Michael Gove too, although at this stage Boris Johnson has said that he just can't fit it in. But that, if anything, does underline the stage that we are almost at the end of Theresa May's time in office. She got through today without too many bumps. But for the Americans, just as for most people watching here, we are about to turn the page and have a different landscape.
OK, Laura, thank you for that. Laura Koonsberg there, our political editor at Westminster.
President Trump put himself at the heart of British politics on the second day of his historic state visit to the UK. Mr. Trump held talks with Theresa May, emerging afterwards to hail the greatest alliance the world has ever known. He promised a phenomenal trade deal if Britain leaves the EU, but suggested everything would be on the table for those talks, including the NHS. He revealed he'd refused to meet Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn, who he called a negative force. And the president also entered the Tory leadership debate, praising Boris Johnson and Jeremy Hunt, but seemingly forgetting he'd ever met Michael Gove. Here's our political editor, Robert Peston, on the compliments and the controversy.
Theresa May and Donald Trump have been working towards this moment, a grand state visit, more or less from the moment he became president just over 2 years ago. But for Theresa May, it's not the celebration and confirmation of a long-term relationship that it was supposed to be. Because she'll be in office only for another few weeks, forced out by MPs who've lost confidence in her. So what on earth could a lame duck Prime Minister achieve in a couple of hours of talks with a US President who disagrees with her about almost everything?
Today, we've discussed again the new and evolving challenges to our security, our values, and our way of life. We share the same view about their origin and our objectives in meeting them. But, like Prime Ministers and Presidents before us, and no doubt those that will come after, we can also differ sometimes on how to confront the challenges we face.
So not always eye to eye, but my goodness, Donald Trump was trying to be helpful.
As the UK makes preparations to exit the European Union, the United States is committed to a phenomenal trade deal between the US and the UK. There is tremendous potential in that trade deal. I say probably 2 and even 3 times of what we're doing right now. Tremendous potential.
And for a little while longer, the president continued to please Theresa May, especially when asked what he thought of Labour's leader Jeremy Corbyn leading public protests against him.
I don't know Jeremy Corbyn, never met him, never spoke to him. He wanted to meet today or tomorrow, and I decided that I would not do that. I think that he is, from where I come from, somewhat of a negative force.
But as for that phenomenal trade deal he promises, there are many in the UK, including the Health Secretary Matt Hancock, who do not want American companies to be able to provide NHS health services. So would he insist on negotiating access for US firms to the NHS?
Look, I think everything with the trade deal is on the table. When you're dealing in trade, everything's on the table. So NHS or anything else, or a lot more than that. But everything will be on the table, absolutely.
The PM didn't look comfortable.
But the point about making trade deals is, of course, that both sides negotiate and come to an agreement about what should or should not be in that trade deal.
But what about the Brexit plan that the Prime Minister agreed with the European Union, but which MPs hate and have rejected 3 times?
And I seem to remember the President suggested that I sued the European Union, which we didn't do. We went into negotiations and we came out with a good deal.
Yeah, that's not such a... I would have sued, but that's okay. I would have sued and settled, maybe, but you never know. She's probably a better negotiator than I am, Jeremy.
High praise indeed from the former property developer who wrote the bestseller, The Art of the Deal.
Perhaps you won't be given the credit that you deserve if they do something, but I think you deserve a lot of credit. I really do. I think you deserve a lot of credit. Okay. Yes, John?
There was an elephant in the room that the PM is standing down, which in the end Donald Trump shone a bright light on when commenting on which of her colleagues, Boris Johnson, Jeremy Hunt or Michael Gove, should succeed her.
So I know Boris. I like him. I've liked him for a long time. I think he'd do a very good job. I know Jeremy. I think he'd do a very good job. I don't know Michael, but would he do a good job, Jeremy? Tell me.
Theresa May's husband Philip in stitches, Jeremy Hunt hiding. The Prime Minister's duty done, reinforcing a relationship between the UK and the US that she'll bequeath sooner than she ever wanted to a new Prime Minister. Robert Peston, ITV News.
Well, as the President and Prime Minister held their news conference inside Whitehall, outside, thousands were protesting against his visit. They were addressed by Jeremy Corbyn, who called for Mr Trump to respect the values of all people. The President, though, described the protests as fake news, claiming he'd only seen a very small number and said they'd been put in for political reasons. Rachel Younger spoke to some of those taking part.
They gathered in front of the National Portrait Gallery, an unwelcome picture for a president who prefers to look the other way, dismissing today's protest of thousands as very small.
Donald Trump's not welcome here! Well, it's unbelievable. It's pouring with rain, it's a working day, it's the middle of the day, and they're still packed out Parliament Square, Trafalgar Square. People are coming off work for this.
It's not as much as the last time, but the mere fact that he's mentioning it means it's getting to him.
It was meant to be a carnival of protest, complete with the controversial baby blimp from the president's last visit and a couple of new additions. This one, ironically, made in China and shipped over by its American creator.
And there's a serious message behind bringing a guest like this to this protest.
Oh, very serious. First of all, it galvanizes people's feelings. And humor is important because otherwise we can't tolerate this.
They're marching not just to show their disdain for President Trump and everything he stands for, but to protest against the invite for a state visit from the government, something many people feel endorses his values.
Even if you're okay with what he stands for, the fact that we're inviting him over, we're not just inviting him, we're inviting his policies, we're inviting his racism, his bigotry, all to our country where it shouldn't be.
Not everyone felt like that. Trump supporters in their trademark red caps bundled away from the protest, with one elderly Trump fan pushed to the ground. Then, just meters from where the president was meeting the Prime Minister, a speech from the man who boycotted last night's state banquet, but called for conversation.
So I say to our visitors that have arrived this week, think on, please, about a world that defeats racism, defeats misogyny, defeats the religious hatreds that are being fueled by the far right in politics, in Britain, in Europe and the United States.
And if the rain affected the numbers attending, it didn't seem to dampen spirits. This was about providing a spectacle the president couldn't ignore, however hard he might try to. Rachel Younger, ITV News.
Well, President Trump didn't just talk up those Tory leadership candidates, he's also been holding meetings with them. Our political correspondent Paul Brand is outside the US ambassador's residence, where the president will host a dinner reception tonight. Paul, what do you know about those meetings?
Well, Geraint, of course, one way to look like a prime minister is by meeting with a president, and we understand 3 leadership candidates will be given that elevation during this trip. One, the Foreign Secretary, Jeremy Hunt, who of course has been in those bilateral meetings during this visit with President Trump. 2, Boris Johnson, who had a phone call with President Trump this morning, a 20-minute phone call. He was offered a face-to-face meeting. We're told he turned that down because he's got to go to some leadership hustings this evening. We're told he's very keen to show just how seriously he is taking this contest. And lastly, I'm told that Michael Gove this evening is still hoping for a visit here. I understand he was given a tap on the shoulder last night at Buckingham Palace and told the president would like to see him. Earlier this evening, though, we saw a rival of a very different kind turning up here. The leader of the Brexit Party, Nigel Farage. Of course, we know that he and the president have a pretty friendly relationship. He was the first British politician to meet President Trump after his election. When it comes, though, to that Tory leadership contest, I think the president has somewhat created a first division here of leadership candidates, and he may well fly out tomorrow, having influenced who he'll be back here dealing with in future.
OK, Paul Brand, many thanks. Well, our political correspondent Romilly Weeks is in Westminster. Romilly, we knew going into today that President Trump was meeting a prime minister on her way out. So what have these talks achieved?
Well, not a great deal in terms of anything concrete, but they have undoubtedly left President Trump with a very warm glow about the UK, and that does count for something. There were the expected warm words about the specialness of the special relationship and that promise of a phenomenal trade deal with the US if the UK becomes freed from what he called the shackles of the EU. But let's not forget, on the subject of that trade deal, that those types of deals take years to set up. They would have to be ratified by Congress, certainly wouldn't be negotiated by this Prime Minister, might not even be negotiated by this President. So it is not something that is entirely in his gift. Number 10 will be relieved, however, that the Prime Minister emerged from this unscathed on what is undoubtedly one of her big occasions, but it was perfectly clear that throughout this, the president was also looking over her shoulder to her potential successor. It is really all about the next Prime Minister now.
OK, Romilly, many thanks.
Well, Donald Trump has been deploying his well-known brand of diplomacy in London, heaping praise on his friends and attacking his detractors. He took time today to see Nigel Farage and to speak to Boris Johnson. He branded Jeremy Corbyn a negative force whose invitation to meet him he had turned down. He lavished praise on the UK and Theresa May, but the outgoing Prime Minister rather, had to endure some embarrassing questions and answers at their joint press conference. And as thousands of anti-Trump protesters were mostly kept away from the president, he said it was all fake news. He'd seen flag-waving supporters. And tonight he's hosting a banquet at the ambassador's residence. It's all been a bit keeping up with the Trumps, as our political editor Gary Gibbon reports.
President Trump wasn't visiting the Queen today, just using her gardens at Buckingham Palace as a helicopter park and ride. His motorcade then took him off towards Westminster. He later spoke of seeing thousands of well-wishers. The Mall, though, looked empty except for police. Many roads shut down for his convoy. Most protesters kept well away. As he turned into Downing Street, one supporter waved a stars and stripes.
Coming over today, there were thousands of people cheering. And then I heard that there were protests. I said, where are the protests? I don't see any protests. I did see a small protest today when I came, very small. So a lot of it is fake news, I hate to say it.
Just round the corner from Downing Street, tens of thousands listened to the Labour leader. Jeremy Corbyn boycotted the state banquet for President Trump last night and said the state visit should never have been allowed.
And by our demonstration here today, we've shown just how determined we, all of us, are to achieve that better place and that better world. Thank you for being here today for peace, for justice and disarmament.
I don't know Jeremy Corbyn, never met him, never spoke to him. He wanted to meet today or tomorrow, and I decided that I would not do that. I think that he is, from where I come from, somewhat of a negative force. I think that people should look to do things correctly as opposed to criticize. I really don't like critics as much as I like and respect people that get things done.
Jeremy Corbyn's office confirmed there had been a request for a working meeting with the President. The President gushed praise at Theresa May and said Brexit would and should happen, even though Theresa May couldn't get her Brexit divorce deal through Parliament.
That deal is teed up. I think that deal is really teed up. I think they have to do something, and perhaps you won't be given the credit that you deserve if they do something, but I think you deserve a lot of credit. I really do. I think you deserve a lot of credit.
Do you agree with your ambassador that the entire economy needs to be on the table in a future trade talk, a trade deal, including the NHS?
I think we're going to have a great trade deal, yes. I think we're going to have a great and very comprehensive trade deal.
With the NHS?
The President didn't quite hear.
Should the NHS be on the table, sir?
I can't hear him. What?
It's the National Health Service. He says, should the National Health Service be on the table?
She probably wished she hadn't helped.
Look, I think everything with a trade deal is on the table. When you're dealing on trade, everything's on the table. So NHS or anything else, or a lot more than that. But everything will be on the table, absolutely. Okay.
But the point about making trade deals is, of course, that both sides negotiate and come to an agreement about what should or should not be in that trade deal.
Not how he sees it, and it prompted an instant tweet from one of those trying to succeed Theresa May. The Health Secretary, Matt Hancock, said, "The NHS isn't on the table in trade talks and never will be, not on my watch." The President went straight from gushing praise at Theresa May to inviting her sworn political enemy, Nigel Farage, in for tea at the US Ambassador's residence. And he was asked about contact with some of the candidates to succeed Theresa May, as one of them, the Foreign Secretary, Jeremy Hunt, looked on.
You had a conversation with Boris Johnson. Could we ask what you spoke about, and will you meet with Michael Gove today?
So I know Boris. I like him. I've liked him for a long time. I think he'd do a very good job. I know Jeremy. I think he'd do a very good job. I don't know Michael, but would he do a good job, Jeremy? Tell me.
The cheek of it amused Philip May. The state visit of President Trump had all been Theresa May's idea. Flattery to the new president, she was first to see at the White House when he took over. A president she, like others, hoped to tame. Next month, she will hand over responsibility for US-UK relations to a successor, at a time when policy divides are deep, and as Britain potentially moves away from EU institutions and seeks closer transatlantic economic ties.
Well, our political editor Gary Gibbon and our international editor Lindsay Hilsum are with me now. What a bizarre day of pomp and politics.
Yes, a bizarre day. And some of the ceremonial, which we expect to be yesterday with the Queen, was kind of there with Theresa May, because she's a lame duck Prime Minister. There isn't much that Donald Trump can get out of talks with her. That was really kind of another bit of the ceremony. The interesting politics here, which I don't think is going to leave the scene very quickly, is when Donald Trump started talking about the free trade agreement with the United States and what it could mean, what he expects of it, and that involvement of the NHS, which he wants on the table. And that is a kind of third rail in British politics. And it's been interesting since the Matthew Hancock tweet. Other candidates have been piling in saying, not on my watch as well. They're not going to allow it to come into those talks. This was a mantra, holy of holies, the US-UK trade agreement that would follow Brexit. And now some of these candidates, even pro-Brexit ones, are beginning to sound a bit like EU leaders were sounding about TTIP not so long ago. But one of these people is going to have to deal with Donald Trump, a successor to Theresa May, and they're going to find him massively unpredictable. There he was, gushing at Theresa May, and then going down the road to the US ambassador's residence. You can see a picture of a couple of other people who've just popped in to see him, Ian Duncan Smith and Owen Patterson. So he's already seen them. He's seen Nigel Farage. He's spoken to He's spoken to Boris Johnson. These are all people with the claim to be Theresa May's nemesis. I mean, it's extraordinary roll call, and we haven't even got to the banquet guest list.
So, Lindsay, special relationship becomes sort of potentially abusive relationship.
Well, look, I don't think Donald Trump has a huge grasp of the NHS. He didn't know what NHS stood for. And when it came to Huawei, you know, we've had all this stuff about, you know, the intelligence relationship between Britain and America could be damaged if Britain signs up for Huawei, the Chinese company, to do its 5G. And he was like, no, it's no problem. The intelligence relationship is all going to be good. He wanted everything to be positive today. But, you know, he said, you know, that out there were no protesters, just cheering crowds for him. You know, it made me think of an old Simon and Garfunkel lyric, all lies and jests, still a man hears what he wants to hear and disregards the rest. And then he was on to his own popularity in the Republican Party. Well, I don't know where he got the figures from, but it was kind of poignant because it's certainly his popularity in his party is much greater than hers, in hers.
I have a 94% approval rating as of this morning in the Republican Party. That's an all-time record. Can you believe that? Isn't that something? I love records. But we have a 94% approval rating in the Republican Party.
So does the relationship between Britain and America actually change?
I don't think you know whether it changes. Of course, it endures whoever is in the White House and whoever is in Downing Street. But certainly this idea that a trade deal would be easy and it would be simple. Look, make America great again. It's as simple as that. He's having a trade war with China. He's working on India. Britain is not that important. It is not at the top of the list. And any kind of trade deal will be on American terms. And of course, Britain, no longer part of the European Union, has far less power. It's quite small, very small compared to the United States. Donald Trump knows that.
Now, Gary, while all this has been going on, the Conservatives have been trying to work out the new rules of their Conservative leadership.
Never one plot line these days, and what they've done is tighten up the rules to try and make a very crowded field a little bit narrower. They're saying that you can only carry on in this contest if you get a certain number of MPs. First round, the threshold 16, second round, 32 MPs. They're piling pressure on individuals who they don't think have got enough support to stop this looking quite so chaotic. And today they got two of them to back out of the contest, James Cleverly and Kit Malthouse.
Well, we'll speak to one of those candidates in a moment, Sam Gyimah. But before we get to that, of course, there's been something of a tiff been going on between the Mayor of London and President Trump. And Jeremy Corbyn was joining protests in London today, of course. Mr. Trump, not one to shy away from confrontation, used his preferred mode of communication, Twitter, to lash out at the mayor. That was before he'd even landed yesterday. Sadiq Khan, he said, who by all accounts has done a terrible job as Mayor of London, has been foolishly nasty to the visiting President of the United States, by far the most important ally of the United Kingdom. He is a stone-cold loser who should focus on crime in London, not me. Well, that war of words between Sadiq Khan and President Trump has been pretty long-running. Mr. Trump described Mr. Khan's response to the London Bridge terror attack as pathetic. And today, the mayor called the president the poster boy for the far right around the world. I went to speak to Sadiq Khan earlier today, and I asked him why he's been picking a fight with Donald Trump.
Well, I'm not picking a fight. This all began, if you remember, when Donald Trump was running to be the president of the USA, and he had a policy to ban all Muslims from entering the USA, but he said he'd make an exception for me as the Mayor of London. And the point I made in a courteous, polite manner back then was, there's nothing exceptional about me. I think your policy's a wrong one, and I think you're playing into the hands of those extremists who say it's irreconcilable to be a Westerner and a Muslim. And that led to this sort of, Twitter spat from him, by the way. There's been no response from me, but I've got to stand up for our values, and that means when I think that somebody who's the leader of America is used as a poster boy for the far right around the globe, for me to articulate that and say that.
But you have also compared him to 1930s fascists. That means Hitler. Is that a sensible comparison?
If you look at the far right playbook, what it is picking on marginalised communities, picking on minority communities, stoking up fear, playing on people's fears to whip up a frenzy. What you're seeing across Europe and across the world is the rise of nativist populist movements. And I think we can't just allow ourselves to sleepwalk into a situation where you've got many, many leaders across the globe who have these nativist views. And we've got to listen, you know, this is a week where we commemorate the D-Day landings. And by the way, I've never objected to Donald Trump coming here on a working relation, as a working relation visit, coming here to commemorate D-Day. My concerns have been the state visit. My concerns have been the state banquet, all it entails, and the rolling out of the red carpet. Why? Because it condones some of the things he's said and done. And it gives succor, by the way, to the global far-right movement.
The trouble is, as soon as you say fascist 1930s, people think Holocaust, mass murder, complete monsters. That is not what Trump is.
The idea you stoke up fears against immigrants, the idea that you pick on marginalised communities, the idea that somehow the LGBT community having equal rights is wrong, rolling back the progress made on gender equality, all these things should concern us.
Do we then need to rethink what the special relationship is?
I'm not asking for Theresa May, heaven forbid, to be Hugh Grant in Love Actually. What I'm saying is, listen, there are some things we disagree with you about. We think you were wrong to walk away from the climate change agreement. You know, we've got a climate emergency. Please think about coming back. It's really important. You can't build a wall around the consequences of climate change. We think, by the way, you know, having equal rights for women is really important. Please understand that if in some states it's almost impossible to have an abortion, these are the consequences. And this, by the way, the conversations we have with our best friend are different from the conversation we'd have with an acquaintance.
Would you have gone to the Chinese state banquet?
Well, I wasn't invited.
No, it was before you were mayor, but would you have gone?
The point I'm making is this: my expectations on China are different to my expectations on the USA. The expectations we have on our closest ally are different. I wouldn't have invited this president.
So they can abuse human rights and have camps.
No, we've got to call them out. I mean, I'm quite clear in relation to not just.
So would you have gone? Is the question. Would you go to a Chinese state banquet now if there was a state visit?
I would make sure I wouldn't go there and give the impression that I support some of the things they stand for. I think it's important when you meet any world leader, you express the concerns you have in a fraternal, collegiate manner. Diplomacy is very important.
Isn't the bit that he got right though? His criticism of you that you should be concentrating on violent crime in London, not the President of the United States. Your record is bad. People are scared in this city, and instead we're talking to you about geopolitics.
But one of the things that good leaders do is do more than one thing at a time. So yes.
But you're not doing that. That's the point.
But yes, you know, crime is important. So, for example, unlike the government, I'm invested in policing in London. Unlike the previous mayor, I've raised council tax and business rates to invest in our police, and so we have in London now a violent crime task force making arrests, bringing charges, but also...
And crime's going up?
No, homicides have gone down in the last year. Under 25 injuries and violent crime have gone down. But the context is we've lost £1 billion from...
They're still much higher than they were, as you know.
Well, violent crime across the country started going up more than 5 years ago. But in London, we're seeing progress in relation to violent crime.
The other person who wasn't at the banquet last night was Sajid Javid, the Home Secretary. Can you think of anything you have in common with Sajid Javid that might mean that he wasn't invited?
Of course, listen, we're both the son of bus drivers. I think this president's got a problem with people whose dads drove buses.
Thank you very much. Well, joining me now is Sam Gyimah, the Conservative MP for East Surrey and a party leadership candidate. What does today tell you about what Britain's post-Brexit relationship with America would really be about?
Well, it's a foretaste of what is to come under a no-deal Brexit scenario where a trade deal with the United States is our best option in terms of international trade we are looking for. The United States will play hardball, they always do, and as Donald Trump said, he would want everything on the table. As far as I'm concerned, you know, the NHS should not be used as a bargaining chip, and I think there are a number of colleagues as well who feel strongly about that, and that means we should be incredibly careful about this idea of a no-deal Brexit.
But realistically, I mean, when the Americans are saying everything's on the table, can Britain protect the NHS when it's in a no-deal Brexit scenario? I mean, we're beggars, not choosers, aren't we?
Well, that is why I have been against the no-deal Brexit, because within that scenario, we are out of control, not in control, and we will be at the mercy of Donald Trump giving us the deal that he wants to do.
So could you realistically make the NHS a red line, or would you just have to relinquish it?
I think that is why I'm fighting against a no-deal Brexit, and the whole basis of my candidacy and the reason why I entered the race and stood on a second referendum platform is that the choice that could face us when the new Prime Minister gets in is a no-deal Brexit or a second referendum, and I think that is the path that we should go down.
But you're not going to survive, are you, the first round of voting?
Look, my campaign is only 48 hours old. Nominations close next Monday in 6 days' time. I've had fantastic support.
How many?
I will be declaring my numbers very soon, but it's only 48 hours old. Some people have been campaigning for weeks and months, so give me time, but I've had some very good support.
Do you have more supporters than I could count on one hand?
I do.
Is my clue. You do?
Yeah.
Right, so you're over 5. But
No, look, the key thing is, I've said I will declare the numbers at the close nominations. This is a competitive process. As other candidates drop out, there are also more people available to approach. And you'd understand why in a competitive process, for good reasons, you don't want to declare your hand too early. So that's why.
How would you get on with Donald Trump? He can't even remember Michael Gove, and he met him and talked to him for a long time.
Anyone who's Prime Minister of the United Kingdom would have to work with the Prime Minister of the United States. You have to find a way to work together.
And so you'd have gone ahead with a state visit. You'd have been there at the banquet.
You've got to work with him, but he puts America first. I'll put Britain first.
Sam Jima, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Now let's go over to that banquet at the US Ambassador's residence, Wingfield House. Kathy is just outside.
Yes, thank you, Christian. I am just outside. This is as close as you can get because if you can see behind me, there's very tight security. The road's been closed off, lots of police. But this is where tonight's banquet is taking place, hosted by President Trump himself. The guest list is something of a closely guarded secret, but I'm hoping to spot a few people coming in and out. Perhaps I should, though, keep an eye on President Trump's Twitter feed, which is now full of videos of the lavish hospitality laid on for the Trump family, and he is clearly reveling in the pomp. But beyond the walls of Buckingham Palace and Downing Street, the atmosphere has been very different, with thousands of anti-Trump protesters taking to the streets of London and other cities. The President himself has been largely shielded from the demonstration, which he's dismissed as very small and fake news. Darshana Soni joined the march from Trafalgar Square to Parliament Square.
They described it as a carnival of resistance. President Trump described it as fake news and very small. Organisers claim that 75,000 took to the streets. Hard to verify, but turnout wasn't as big as the last time he visited. The polarising president managed to unite the full spectrum of left-wing causes.
It's not just about chlorinated chicken, even though that is what I'm dressed as today.
He's a climate change denier, and then there's his racism, his homophobia.
Have you come out on Eid?
Yeah, we have come out on Eid today. It's important to come out on Eid, actually, to say that Trump's politics isn't welcome here in the UK.
But do you feel a bit disheartened knowing that all of his minders and the people with him will keep him so far away from this? He might not even know what's going on.
He'll hear the message. We're confident of that.
Mr. Trump certainly did hear a message, even if it was his own version. As he was tucked away in Downing Street, demonstrators were prevented from marching directly past. Perhaps at that distance it was easy to mistake their jeers for cheers.
It was tremendous spirit and love. There was great love. It was an alliance. And I didn't see the protesters until just a little while ago, and it was a very, very small group of people put in for political reasons. So it was fake news.
The Metropolitan Police said their officers, 3,500 of them had been deployed, made just one arrest. Although there were some minor skirmishes.
You have to open your mind to people, hang on, maybe these people don't think he's a racist.
When a handful of Donald Trump supporters braved the crowds.
No, he's not. Oh my God, bro.
You seem to have wandered into the wrong protest.
No, I don't think so. I was just expressing my support for the United States.
George Clinton is from Richmond in Virginia.
Queen Elizabeth should declare a snowflake emergency. There's a lot of people who are very down on the United States, and that's very sad.
We will not stand for that. We will fight with every last breath of our body.
The Labour leader was in his element here, criticising Mr. Trump's policies on immigration, human rights and climate change. His supporters didn't seem too worried at the president's description of him as a negative force.
I'm not saying Trump's a fascist, but he's given strength to fascists and the far right.
He doesn't like being snubbed, does he, Donald Trump? How do you think he'll treat Corbyn if he is elected?
Oh, I think in a similar way to the way he's treated Sadiq Khan. He'll use some of his childish language in the same way. You know, say that he's a loser or comment on his physical appearance or other sort of childish bullying insults and things like that.
Organisers had hoped that this would be the biggest demonstration in British history. They didn't quite achieve that, but declared it a success. The President declared, meanwhile, that there was a lot of love for him in London today.
Well, I'm joined now by prize-winning author Arundhati Roy, who's just written a book of political essays, My Seditious Heart. There were thousands on the street today, but it was significantly lower than the last set of Trump demonstrations in the UK. Do you think people are getting sort of inured to him, perhaps?
I doubt it. I mean, I think the people who are against him are still against him, and the people who are for him and all that he stands for
I'm sorry.
Still be for him.
I'm sorry to interrupt. We seem to have a problem with your sound. We'll try and come back to you as soon as we have that. As soon as we do, right. Well, we can now return to my conversation with Arundhati Roy, the novelist, about those protests. Do you think people are getting inured to the idea of Donald Trump in the White House, and that's why there wasn't such a big turnout for the protests today?
See, I think we make the mistake of going on and on about Donald Trump, you know. Trump is here like a monarch visiting one of his colonies, like the Queen of England used to visit India long ago, you know. And the point is, what is he doing here? He's giving you advice about who should be Prime Minister. He's telling you that you should dismantle the NHS. Those are the things that matter, you know, whereas continuously talking about Trump and making fun of him just actually builds his base, because he's presenting himself as this commoner, the opposite of the Queen, who's now, and the Queen is being forced to entertain him, you know. So the more we make fun of these individuals, the more we lose sight of what they represent.
But nevertheless, you have to roll out the red carpet, don't you? He's a visiting US president, and that relationship is paramount, isn't it?
Maybe to England, I don't know. And obviously these are power games. You know, it happened when the French president came to India and so on. Yet for us, it was more, you look at it in a cynical way. You know, what is he selling? What are you buying? What is he telling people to do? And behind the personality, the tweets, the absurdness, there is a pretty canny political game going on, I think. And I think people understand that too. I don't think the size of the protest really is a measure of whether people are getting inured to him or not.
It's
but
not a
perhaps,
litmus test.
Yeah, I think people are just now very, from the few days I've spent here, very exercised about what does Brexit mean and what is going to happen. And it's divided in ways where Trump is just one of the players supporting one of the sides, but a monarch, nevertheless, visiting his colony.
Whether it's Donald Trump or Modi or any other populist all around the world, how should the people respond to the rise of these populists and also the fact that they keep on winning?
See, this is, I think, a really good question, because what happens is that you see it in India too and in the US. Somehow they have managed to turn pain into pleasure. So somehow the policies that create this great inequality and therefore the great resentment and the great anger are harnessed by the very forces that create that inequality and then are used to perpetuate that inequality. So it's a sort of magic trick where they turn that anger into a kind of identity politics, a tribal politics, a nationalist politics, and therein lies the key, because the other side is not prepared to play so dirty. So how do you, in that case, correct a machine that's going very wrong? It's a question for all of us.
But they're having the last laugh, though, aren't they?
Well, I don't know. He doesn't look very happy, but maybe so.
He's having a great time.
Maybe so, but let's not forget that just a few years ago you had London in flames, you have Paris in flames. You are going to see lots of trouble in lots of places, because you can't just seal off the exits and turn everything into a spectacle. So these people are the masters of spectacle, but beyond a point, the spectacle will not hold.
Arundhati Roy, thank you very much for joining us.
You're welcome.
If you were looking for hyperbole and disaster, inappropriate hand-holding and wrong-footed moments, acrimony and insults, you might be disappointed. Donald Trump's second day here was, by pretty much any metric, a success. A remarkably well-behaved president got to promise Britain his phenomenal trade deal. He praised Theresa May's tackling of Brexit and even acknowledged what he called, with his traditional love of understatement, the greatest alliance the world has ever known. Yes, there were awkward moments along the way, in particular for Jeremy Corbyn, who had to admit that he had actually requested a meeting with President Trump. Trump had turned him down. And for Michael Gove, a prime ministerial hopeful whom President Trump claimed not to know. Perhaps the moment of greatest discomfort for hardline Brexiteers came when the US president restated that everything, including the NHS, would be up for grabs in any future US trade deal, a remark quickly slapped down by his host Theresa May. Outside there was drizzle, and the protests of last year, bright blue blimpy skies, were not matched in any number today. So what's happened? Has the president got better behaved? Have we got used to him? Or are our own problems now so intractable we just don't have the energy to care? Here's Nick Watt.
The commander-in-chief from over there, who for the moment commands the field over here. A day of pomp gave way to a day of politics. And a power vacuum here provided rich pickings for the disruptor-in-chief.
A packed Downing Street for Donald Trump for what he regards as the far less exciting day two of his state visit. Less exciting because he's talking to a lame duck Prime Minister.
But business is business.
Mr. Ambassador, how's the visit going? Good trade deal in the offing? Yeah. The talks are underway. The presidential motorcade is clogging up Downing Street. And perhaps in number 10, they could just about hear the din of the protest out there.
Anger on the street as ritual pleasantries were exchanged over lunch. And then onto the political feast.
Mr. President, have you got a good trade deal? A good trade deal, Mr. President?
A confused Britain was on the menu. Fun with the Tory leadership contenders.
So I know Boris. I like him. I've liked him for a long time. I think he'd do a very good job. I know Jeremy. I think he'd do a very good job. I don't know Michael. But would he do a good job, Jeremy? Tell me.
I am not, absolutely not, refusing to meet anybody.
Outside, Jeremy Corbyn was in his natural habitat.
Together we can make a big difference. Together we can change this world. Together we can bring about that peace and justice. And by our demonstration here today, we've shown just how determined we, all of us, are to achieve that better place and that better world.
It turned out that Britain's most famous street protester had hoped to be in the room.
I don't know Jeremy Corbyn. Never met him. Never spoke to him. He wanted to meet today or tomorrow, and I decided that I would not do that. I think that he is, from where I come from, somewhat of a negative force. I think that people should look to do things correctly as opposed to criticize. I really don't like critics as much as I like and respect people that get things done. We're going to have a great...
And then down to business with a declaration that access to the NHS would have to form part of a free trade deal.
I can't hear him. What?
It's the National Health Service, he says.
First, a little help to explain the question.
Look, I think everything with the trade deal is on the table. When you're dealing in trade, everything's on the table. so NHS or anything else, or a lot more than that. But everything will be on the table, absolutely.
A gentle rebuke.
But the point about making trade deals is, of course, that both sides negotiate and come to an agreement about what should or should not be in that trade deal.
Then the gloves came off as the Health Secretary said, hands off our NHS.
I can't see any British government putting the NHS on the table for the private sector to take chunks out of. My message is this is a storm in a teacup. I really don't think that this is what will be at the heart of the trade negotiations. Delighted that President Trump has made clear he wants to have a serious negotiation once we've left the EU in developing trade relationship with the US, but the NHS is not going to be part of it.
Labour spotted danger.
Well, this shows absolutely the dangers of Brexit. We could be exposed to the loss of our National Health Service. Parts of it sold off to American companies. People right across the political spectrum here support the NHS and don't want it to be sold off. This shows the dangers of Brexit. Well, the candidates to be the next Prime Minister will be very genuine in what they say, but they are unleashing a situation that they simply won't be able to control.
Tonight, a return to the formality of a state visit. But only after the President had played host to Britain's own disruptor-in-chief.
Well, we're joined now by Alistair Burt. He was a minister in the Foreign Office under Boris Johnson and then Jeremy Hunt before resigning earlier this year. And Dawn Butler, who serves in Labour's shadow cabinet as their spokesperson for women and equality. She spoke at the anti-Trump protests in Parliament Square today, where, Dawn, Jeremy Corbyn was protesting and didn't mention, perhaps he should, that he'd been turned down for a request to meet Donald Trump.
But he did actually say that he had written to Donald Trump and said, let's meet. The fact that Donald Trump has turned him down, I think, is something that Donald Trump needs to take responsibility for. At the end of the day, Jeremy was being the adult in the room.
Nobody knew that Jeremy Corbyn had even asked for a meeting with Donald Trump. All we knew was that he had boycotted the banquet in this rather grand gesture and gone outside to the streets to play to his base instead.
I know, but Jeremy's always said from the very beginning that he's happy to meet and talk to Donald Trump, but he just didn't want all the pomp and ceremony of a state visit attached to it. But he's always said he's very happy to speak to Donald Trump.
He managed the pomp and ceremony of a state banquet with the Chinese Premier Xi Jinping.
Yeah, but we are talking about Donald Trump and this special relationship that the UK has with the US. And so it's not actually about the man, it's about respecting the office. And Jeremy's doing that by saying, let's meet, let's sit down, let's talk about issues. And Donald Trump said he didn't want to meet.
If it's about pomp and ceremony and avoiding that, why would he go to a banquet with the Chinese Premier Xi Jinping? It's worth remembering today, 30 years on from a massacre that killed thousands of pro-democracy supporters on the streets and covered it up. He didn't have qualms about that, but he couldn't attend one with our closest ally in the Office of State as US President.
Well, I do understand that Jeremy, as I understand it, raised issues and human rights issues with the President. But the point is this.
So he could have done the same with Donald Trump, because Donald Trump said he'd never met him, he'd never had a meeting with him. And
yeah, but the point is he didn't, but he did say that he would meet Donald Trump, and Donald Trump refused to meet him. Now, that to me is somebody who is respecting the office of the President of the United States and saying, let's sit down, let's have a business meeting and let's talk about issues. And Donald Trump didn't want to.
There was the occasion for your leader to have met him. It's such an easy option, isn't it, to find a protest? The difficult choice is to rise above your personal feelings, be the grown-up, go to the official state meeting, make your point there, rather than hang around complaining and shouting in a megaphone.
But no, I think it's really important. I think that at the end of the day, when you believe passionately in something, you should stand up and you should shout about it. And we believe passionately, not just in democracy, but we believe in equality, we believe in the rights of women, we believe that you shouldn't call the Mayor of London names before you even come off the plane. And I think when you believe in something so passionately, so strongly, of course you should stand up and talk about it and shout about it. I hope that I'll be shouting about things and, you know, whilst I'm in a wheelchair. Yeah. At the end of the day, Donald Trump and the hate message that he sends, the way he likes to other people, the way he likes to put people down, the way he likes to dehumanize people, is extremely dangerous and extremely damaging. And for not 1 second should we be rolling out the red carpet for
It's just
him.
difficult, isn't it, to talk about a hate message when your own party's being investigated for anti-Semitism. It's difficult to say that you want to be shouting about inequality when you're old and in a wheelchair. You're the Equalities Minister and your own party's sweeping under the carpet claims of sexual harassment.
I think you're wrong. I don't think we are sweeping it under the carpet at all, and we haven't done from the very beginning. And we've worked really hard in terms of strengthening.
On that issue, then, has David Prescott been suspended?
One second. On strengthening our procedures, and the EHRC investigating the Labour Party is a good thing, because at the end of the day, what we cannot then argue is that we haven't got the best procedures.
It was a really simple question. Has he been suspended? If you think you're doing the right thing, has he been suspended?
Well, you're asking me about...
You've just said the NEC is a good thing, and you've said that you're doing everything possible. Has he been suspended?
I said the EHRC investigating means that you will not be able to argue with our policies and our procedures. You've asked me about an individual case. And now I can't tell you directly about an individual case because I don't know all the details. But what I do know is that when a informal complaint was made, that the person in question, I understand, was suspended straight away.
Okay.
And then they sought to have a formal complaint made, and that wasn't done. I can't tell you all the details because it's an individual case that I'm not involved in.
Let's get back to Trump and the state visit with Alistair Burt. And the point is whether the practicalities have been played badly or well by Corbyn. He is where the public is. There is a lot of distaste for that president right now, and a lot of your party being quite sycophantic with him.
I'm not sure if he's exactly where the public is. I think there is a difference in registering your view about someone you dislike, as you've indicated, but taking part in a public protest and shouting about the president. Now, should Jeremy Corbyn become the Prime Minister, that may come back to bite him, because the relationship that we need with the United States to talk about difficult things as well as the important things like alliances where we agree requires a degree of engagement. And I would imagine the President will remember that Jeremy Corbyn was at this mass protest today saying what he said.
So he was on the streets, but meanwhile we had all these shadowy meetings which weren't really understood between Ian Duncan-Smith, Owen Paterson, Nigel Farage. You're seeing a sort of pattern growing up here.
I think we are.
Michael Gove. I mean, that must leave you feeling very sick to the spirit, doesn't it?
I think my personal feelings needn't come into it. I
Why?
think it was.
Why?
I think it was interesting to see Nigel Farage. They're obviously friends and have a relationship. Ian Duncan-Smith and Owen Paterson, outstanding Secretaries of State, clearly on a same wavelength in relation to Brexit as the President and wanting their meetings. But there were plenty of other people that he was seeing.
This is your party and you're in power, and we're going to see a new Prime Minister imposed. And they're talking to a US President about his style of Brexit?
Yeah,
What's going on?
Hold on. The President had perfectly proper meetings with the Cabinet, with the Foreign Secretary, with the Chancellor, with the Prime Minister. Those are the meetings. If the President wants to see others in the spare time that he has during a visit, as he made clear, those are his choices. And he made them.
To speak about no-deal Brexit, or
absolutely.
to speak about what he's going to do with his phenomenal trade. Do you buy that, a phenomenal trade deal?
It'll be a phenomenal trade deal for America.
Right. Which tells you everything you need to know about what he's got in mind.
This is a trade deal where the United States has far greater power than the United Kingdom. It will call for very skilled negotiation. There will be some difficult areas, which is why engagement is really necessary. And that's part of the state visit. But there's no doubt that this is a deal where the Americans go into it with a great deal more on their side than ours. But we have great things. We have great things to trade, and we will do so. But it will not be an easy trade, as everyone has made clear.
I mean, in the space of what seems like about an hour, he's already flip-flopped on his comments on the NHS, which he made in the press conference, and told Piers Morgan for an interview tomorrow that actually the NHS wouldn't be on the table. I don't know whether you think that that's optimistic and gratifying, or whether you think it's a clear demonstration of a man whose words you simply cannot believe from 1 hour to the next.
It's not for me to make that comment about the President of the United States. I think what's clear is that the American approach will be to have as much on the table as possible. There is an imbalance in terms of services. The Americans will be looking to do something in relation to that. I'm absolutely certain what the Prime Minister said, what Matt Hancock said about NHS not being part of the deal is absolutely true. But the Americans will look for compensation elsewhere. That's why negotiation is really important. We've got good trade negotiators, we've got good skilled colleagues in the Cabinet, and those were the people that the President was really engaging with.
Thank you both very much indeed. Well, the American journalist Michael Wolff's 2018 book, Fire and Fury, which documented Trump's chaotic first months in office, was a publishing sensation, sparked harsh condemnation from the White House. He's now written another one, Siege, Trump Under Fire, about more recent times, and he joins us from New York. I don't think anyone envisaged this visit going as smoothly as it has today and yesterday. You'd grant him that, Michael, would you?
Yeah, well, the visit from a year ago was so catastrophic that they have spent, I understand, an enormous amount of time trying to get Donald Trump to behave himself on this visit.
So you think it just went better than it could have done because of last year?
Well, last year was the model for them not to repeat. Yeah, you know, everybody is always holding their breath. Nobody knows what's going to happen when Donald Trump does anything, which is the sort of the premise. What's the premise of the book that I've written, the second book I've written about this administration, but the premise of how everyone treats Donald Trump. You cannot for a second pretend that you know what's going to happen.
His visit.
And so, actually, curiously, when he behaves himself, that's almost more shocking than the usual catastrophes that follow him.
Yeah, I think you're right, because his visit, perhaps a bit like your book, only has the power to shock once. I mean, The Siege, when I was reading it, feels like Steve Bannon's book. It has him at its soul. It reads a bit like you've been played, Michael.
Well, I don't know what that means. Steve Bannon is a figure, a character throughout the book, because I certainly in my experience, he is the one person who has understood Donald Trump at every step of the way, understood him well enough to get him elected, and understood all of his failings, and in fact, understood him to the point where he believes that he will not be reelected.
Right. Well, so Steve Bannon could have written the book. I mean, you describe him in the acknowledgement as your Virgil guiding you on a descent into Trump world. Why on earth would you choose an embittered ex-employee as your primary source?
Well, I just said that because the truth is he may be all of that. As a matter of fact, I believe that Steve's conflicted relationship with Donald Trump has actually produced incredible insights on his part into who this man is. Steve loves Donald Trump, can't stand Donald Trump. Steve wants to be with Donald Trump, is repulsed by Donald Trump. And by the way, it goes the other way too. So these two men are in this remarkable codependent relationship. I mean, this is one of the really, and this is why I focused on it, one of the really extraordinary political stories and political relationships of our time.
Except a lot of people get dragged into that rather dark web. You make insinuations about Trump's affairs, about sexual misconduct. You talk about Trump telling multiple confidants.
I don't really make insinuations. I mean, I'm fairly clear in what I say, and in terms of affairs, the insinuations I make is that Donald Trump did not have an affair.
Well,
he just bragged about it.
Okay.
So remember, the whole point of
you drag a woman's name through the mud.
Is to
you drag a woman's name through the mud. I'm not going to do that, but you say a high-profile woman had given him, in your words, a blowjob. It was a species of his famous locker room talk.
No, that's not what I said. No,
he told multiple confidants that a right. He had told multiple confidants.
I said that he said that.
Right.
Okay, let me tell you why that's important information. Because when a president of the United States, when his default at all times is to demean women, that is important information. People need to know that.
Okay, so
I
why
am
would
the
you...
person who say it because other people won't say this.
Right, so she has denied it, and you know that he's a pathological liar, so why repeat it with her name?
You're missing... Because that is precisely the point. He is a pathological, well, I'm not sure he's a liar, pathological liar in this situation. He's a braggart. The fact that the brag is probably not true just goes to the deeper fact of his own weird psychopathology here. But if the President of the United States is making sexual insinuations about one of the senior women in his administration, that is information that people need to know.
Okay, I'm going to quote you Michelle Obama. When she spoke at the convention in 2016, her rallying cry was, "When they go low, we go higher." Now, that is out the window. With this kind of writing, you're on the floor. You're trying to go even lower than President Trump.
No. Listen. First thing, I'm not a politician. I am a writer. What I am trying to do, what my job is to do, is to create this world so people can come close to experiencing it as it is. That's what people, need to do, and that's what people, the incredible hunger out there is, what happens here? Who is this guy? What is going on? And I would argue that I'm bringing everybody closer to that than anyone else is doing.
Michael Wolff, thank you for explaining that to us. Thank you.